So excited. This has actually been getting me through quarantine tonight. Like to have John and Bill on together is
Okay.
really exciting. And hold on, let me shut my door because my sorry. So we're gonna do it just a little bit. Hey, Will, can you let Scotty out? Okay, here we go again. We'll try again. First of all, too, I want to thank Ken and Kayleen who facilitate Connect every week. They do it in Salt Lake at the house when we're open. And then they had the idea, Kayleen did, to put it online. And I think it's been really fun and important. And we've had some great conversations over the past few weeks. And I'll have, maybe Kayleen, do you want to tell about who else is going to be coming on over the next few weeks?
Yeah, next week is going to be Thomas McConkey, and Ken can tell you a little bit more, but we're very excited for Thomas McConkey. Then we're having Greg Prince will be on, and then also Kayleen Potter, the mayor from Heber. And we have others in mind. I guess we're going to keep going because it doesn't look like it's going to be ending anytime soon. So it will just keep going until we're done with this. So we're very excited, and we thank you all for coming. So.
And I guess I'll put in the plug also that we have Lisa Dame, who has done Lunch with Lisa in Salt Lake for the past year, and Kayleen, and then Lisa Holmberg, the reason for Lunch with Lisa, is also on. And on Tuesdays and Wednesdays at 12 o'clock, they do another online Zoom call of smaller groups, that are just more all about conversation and talking about, hey, what are you doing? What do you think about this? How can you help me with that kind of conversation? So know that those are also available, and then we'll get started. Tonight, we're going to do it just a little bit different than most Connects. Most Connects, we start out with Ken and Kayleen interviewing whoever's on. Like when Wendy did it, she told her story and they kind of went back and forth. Tonight, we're going to just turn it over to John and Bill, because theirs is a little unique because it's going to be focused more on research, and they've got some slides to show. And I think that for most of us, we are very familiar with Bill and John. And if you don't mind, I want to take just a minute to introduce them, because I owe both of them a great deal, and I'm super grateful for both of them. I want to start out with talking about Bill for a minute. When I was a kid, I lived just right up the hill from where I live now, and Bill Bradshaw was in my ward. And Bill would never remember me because I think I was 8 or 9 when we moved out. But Bill had 5 children who were all about older than I was. And one of them was Brett Bradshaw. And my brother, Brett, and his other best friend, Brett Palmer, hung out. And so it was always Brett, and Danny. And, they were always getting in trouble and doing whatever. But later, Bill's daughter became my piano teacher. And I do know that Bill's kids were always the kids at Orem High who were the athletes, the really beautiful kids, the ones who we all admired, and they were definitely the smartest kids. And so I think out of Bill's 3 sons, I had a huge crush on 2 of them. And sadly, one of them loved my best friend instead, but that's all forgiven. But anyway, so years later, I'd heard that Bill's son Brett had come out, and we were on a family reunion in Idaho. And my brother says, hey, there's this podcast on this Mormon stories that we should listen to. So we listened to Bill. John, how long was it? It was like 6 episodes?
Yeah, 5 or 6 hours, yeah.
And that's how we spent our family reunion. And my eyes were just opening up to so many things I didn't know or had never thought about or understood, listening to this conversation between Bill and John. So I moved back to Utah and decided eventually to do Encircle. And the first person I want to talk to is Bill Bradshaw. So I go knock on that door I used to take piano lessons from, and well, we went to lunch first. Someone took us to lunch, but then Bill and I kept going to John for all these questions, like, what would you do about this? What would you do about that? And then Bill ended up doing pamphlets for us with all of his many years of research. And I was going to bring those pamphlets and show you, just so you're aware, but they're online. We've got them at Encircle. You can come and get them anytime you want. And they are full of years and years of valuable research, and just so grateful for Bill and Margie for all their years that they've spent serving other people and trying to help this with the LGBTQ community. I'm taking way too long. So Bill, we're just so grateful for you. And then comes John. So this is really quick, I'll be fast, but when I was going through a faith transition and thought that I would never have a friend again in my life, I started listening to Mormon Stories podcast, and Holly Alden invited us up to Midway to an event where I realized we weren't alone and that there were a lot of us who were struggling. And that was the minute that I saw a future in being able to live in Provo and being able to be my authentic self and to have real friends and live an authentic life. And we can all talk about how many podcasts we've listened to of John's, but just so grateful for him. So when I called originally when I called John Williams and asked John if he would help me do this, and he said sure, my second call was to John Dehlin to say, John, what do I do? Like, I don't even know what questions to ask. I really don't know anything about the LGBTQ community. And I said, I'm having this lunch in Ogden with John Williams and another woman to start this thing. What do I do? And John was immediately, I'll drive down from Logan. I'll meet you at lunch. I'll help you facilitate the conversation. And that was the last time I ever saw John Williams. And I got to share that with John. So anyway, sorry I'm taking so long. I just want to make sure that so many people know how grateful I am to them, and that none of us would be here tonight without people who were brave and forged the way for all of us. With that, I'll turn this over to you two who are the experts, and thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. Well, I'm going to start. We want to share with you things that we have found from a study that we conducted to Overwhelm. And we thought one good way to do it would be to present some of the information visually, so that it would be a little easier for viewers to understand as they accompany our verbal message. John, show us the first slide. So here's a picture of us. Our most important other collaborator is Renee Gallagher in the Department of Psychology at Utah State. So we're going to tell you what we found out in a survey of 1,612 LGBTQ individuals who were current or former members of the LDS Church. Just a comment about the number 1612. It's big. Most published studies are in the neighborhood of 200 or maybe 300 respondents. So we had a very nice response to our study. Next one, John. Okay. We published widely, trying to get as many people from a diverse set of sources as we could. This shows that we published nationally in a series of newspapers. The study was done for several weeks in the fall of 2011. Next. So this tells you the distribution of sources from which people learned about our study and decided to participate. So there are, we tried hard to get Mormon LGBT support groups, both on the left and right, if you will. Social media provided information for a lot of people. There's a great diversity of places where we enlisted people. Next. All right, this briefly describes the characteristics of the people who responded to the study. Only 1/4 were women. Mid-30s was the average age. Most probably naturally were white, but we got respondents from 48 of the states of the country and 22 countries outside of the US. These were people who were well educated and higher than average income. Next. One other comment about the nature of our respondents. So this shows the people with respect to their status in the LDS Church. And it's roughly 1/3 who were active, 1/3 who were inactive, and 1/3 who'd had some formal dissociation from the church through resignation, etc. Roughly 1/3 in those 3 categories. Now, just one comment before I say something about the next slide. We have published 8 manuscripts on various aspects of our study in the professional literature, primarily in the literature of social science and religious studies. One of them is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. In addition, there's a chapter, and we have 2 more manuscripts. One has just been submitted and another in the works. All right, now, next slide. So we want to tell you next about just one aspect of the personal experience of these people. We have a great many others, but this is shown just as an example. So we asked people 5 questions about milestones in their personal lives that reflected their sexual identity development. The first question was, when did you first feel different than someone your age? The next question was, when did you sense that this difference had to do with sexuality? Next, when did you have a same-sex romantic or sexual experience? And finally, the last 2 had to do with coming out. When did you tell somebody else? When did you come out to yourself? When were you willing to accept yourself as non-heterosexual? So you see the average, the data show the average years for men and women. So for gay men, they first sensed a difference at age 9. Now at this time, these people didn't have the experience or the language to understand what it was about themselves that they thought was different than their peers. A couple of years later, they did have enough sense, enough experience, the language to express it in terms of sexuality. One other comment before we leave this: if we subdivided our respondents into those between the ages of 18 and 30, the last 3 milestones came at earlier years, about 3 years earlier. It suggests an important fact that the younger generation is more open and more likely to achieve some negotiation of their sexual identity at an earlier age. Next. All right. This figure represents the data just for the males in our study. So there are 3 bits of information along the bottom: B, AP, MS, and MA. These are markers of the religious experience of active male Latter-day Saints. So you see baptism at age 8, priesthood, missionary service, and so on. So from 0 to 40, these are the ages that people reported experiences. The arrows, 1 through 5, represent the same milestones that we just looked at in the table. So age 9 at first recognition, and then coming out in the early 20s. Let me just say that we had people from 18 to 75. So the average for the whole group is about 20 for the coming out events. As I mentioned, it's 3 years earlier on average for those who are younger. And finally, those symbols at the top of this figure, the circles, triangles, and squares, those represent the average age at which the males in our study endeavored to cope with, to understand, or to change their non-heterosexuality. You see that those efforts represent both personal and professional efforts. It's now my time to turn over to John to pursue those in a little more detail. Go, John.
Thanks, Bill. And Stephanie, thanks for that lovely introduction. If we were ever ahead of you, you passed us up in 3 days, and now you're light years ahead. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. And I'm honored to be co-presenting with Bill, and grateful for all the work all of you do. It's so important. Okay, so now that Bill's kind of given us the introduction, I'll jump into the first topic that we wanted to understand, which was to what extent do our participants attempt to change their sexual orientation throughout their lives? And if any of you have any historical memory regarding the Mormon LGBT experience, you'll remember that back in 2010, 2011, there was still an organization called Evergreen that existed, that was unofficially but very directly supported by the LDS Church. And Evergreen explicitly and openly and publicly supported conversion therapy or reparative therapy. They would have presentations and conferences, sometimes on church headquarters. They would have an emeritus general authority come speak. And it was just very common in the Mormon experience for there to be 3 things that were recommended. One was sexual orientation change efforts or conversion therapy. One was celibacy, and one was mixed orientation marriage. And Bill and I wanted to understand, there were a lot of anecdotes and people's stories around the problems with those choices, but there wasn't a lot of data. And Bill came to me and said, John, we need to gather some data. And that was the beginning of this whole project. And so the very first question that we really wanted to dig into, and the first set of papers that we published, was on the sexual orientation change efforts. And instead of just asking about attempts to change sexual orientation through visiting a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist, probably, in my view, one of our most significant contributions in our body of research was that we asked about several other types of attempts at change. So in addition to psychotherapy, which has gotten a lot of press, we asked about support groups, about group therapy, about group retreats, family therapy, psychiatry. And then the most significant things we asked about actually had nothing at all to do with therapeutic interventions. It was simply, to what extent do our LGBT Mormon youth and young adults try to change their sexual orientation through either personal righteousness, which included prayer, scripture study, temple attendance, extra callings, extra fasting, serving missions, just all the ways you can be hyper-religious to try and make this inconvenient thing go away. We also asked about the attempt to which our LGBT youth and adults tried to go to their bishop or mission president or stake president to change their sexual orientation. And then we asked about other individual efforts, which might include reading, studying, talking to friends, that sort of thing. And we found out that I want to say about 2/3 of our sample, a little over 1,000, reported making some form or attempt at changing their sexual orientation. I believe on average, they tried at least 3 different of these 9 methods, 9 or 10 methods. Bill, you can correct me if I've got that wrong. And we ended up tallying the prevalence. So which were the most common? And what's super important, I think, about this first slide is that when you guys have heard about sexual orientation change efforts, all you've heard about is psychotherapy. And what this slide shows is that we've been hyper-focusing on the 4th most common way that our LGBTQ youth attempt to change their sexual orientation. The truth is, it's not even in the top 3. It's good that we're focusing on it because it is very harmful and it's unethical and it needs to stop. But what we have been missing prior to this study, and what I think we've also in many ways been missing since the study, are these other efforts, personal righteousness and church counseling specifically. So 76% of those who attempted change attempted to do so through personal righteousness, 47% through church counseling with the bishop or stake president or mission president, and then 55% through other sort of individual efforts. And we think that's a really significant finding. And this next slide I'll be very brief about, but all you really need to understand about this slide is that red and orange are bad. And so if you accept the fact that people attempt these interventions with the intent of getting better, then you would not expect the medicine, so to speak, to cause harm. And what this slide shows is the 3 most common forms of sexual orientation change efforts, which is individual effort, church counseling, and righteousness, were used at the longest duration. So on average, those who tried through individual effort to change their sexual orientation tried so on average for 9 years. So imagine pleading with God, fasting, serving in multiple callings, serving a mission for 9 years to change your sexual orientation. And in terms of church counseling, imagine counseling with your bishop or stake president for 7 years, trying to make this go away. And I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Personal righteousness was 11 years. Church counseling was 6.6 years, and other individual efforts were 9 years. And so and then the red and the orange shows how damaging those interventions actually were. Sometimes as high as 45% reported harm as a result of these attempts to change. So just to summarize this slide, the most damaging methods to change your sexual orientation were used most frequently for the longest duration. So it's sort of this perfect storm of harm that has been the experience of many of our Mormon LGBTQ youth, and none of that even mentions the psychotherapy or the psychiatric or the group therapy interventions. So the takeaway here is that the most damaging thing our LGBT youth are doing are trying to pray to Heavenly Father and say, take this away, fast, go to the temple, be extra righteous, get married in the temple, all these ways to be hyper-religious to make it go away. And that's the most common and the most damaging thing that they can do. And it's something that I think we maybe aren't talking enough about, and that's probably because it's really sensitive, because it involves church leaders, it involves prayer and scripture study and sensitive things that in any other form would be beneficial, but in this scenario, in this context, it can be more harmful. So how effective overall were these attempts at change? You actually don't usually want a 0% finding in science, because it can cause some people, to sort of maybe suspect that you're cooking the books. But when we did an average of a percentage of how many of the people who attempted change reported that they eliminated their same-sex attraction through their attempts at change, literally 0% said that it was successful at eliminating their same-sex attraction. So we've got over 1,000 respondents. Remember, a third of them are active in the church, and yet 0% said that their attempts at eliminating their same-sex attraction were successful. So they're spending 8, 9, 10, 11 years on something that has a 0% success rate if success means elimination of their same-sex attraction. 3% reported some change in their sexual orientation. Bill is going to explain kind of what, one example of what that means, but it does not mean they were cured. And Bill will talk a bit about that. And then 40% reported harm from their sexual orientation change efforts. And I'll just ask you, if sexual orientation change efforts were a drug, and the FDA were to consider its, approval, would the FDA approve a drug where 40% of the time the people who use it as directed are going to experience harm or severe harm? They would not recommend it. So SOCE is just a really, ineffective and or very damaging sort of practice. Bill, would you mind taking, do you want to talk to this slide, Bill?
That's fine.
Just because I think you would do a good job with this slide.
All right, so these are quotations that represent when people said they had a change as a result of all of this effort. What was the nature of the change? One was a change in behavior. I think about these things, I don't act on it. My behavior is the same. There was some kind of a diminishment, but it never went away. I've decided to redefine myself. I'm really not gay. I'm just somebody with a problem that I'm working on. These efforts help me to decrease the negative feelings that I had about myself. Next.
Yeah, and so, there are, people did report benefits from their attempts of changing their sexual orientation. But the benefits, the most common benefit we found was basically people saying, I tried to change, realized I couldn't, and then I learned to just accept who I was. That was actually the most beneficial outcome of their attempts at change. They also sometimes experienced a decrease in depressive or anxiety symptoms, at least in part probably because they finally talked to somebody, they finally were able to stop being secluded, closeted, and bottled up. And in some cases, they talk to therapists who might attempt to treat their anxiety or depression. But certainly the benefits weren't the removal of same-sex attraction and making them straight, so to speak. In terms of the harm, it included decreased self-esteem, increased self-shame, increased depression and anxiety, wasting of time and money, distance from God and church, worsening of family relationships, and increased suicidality. And this for me is probably the most important message of all the findings personally. Why would somebody who tried to change their sexual orientation through prayer and scripture study and fasting end up suicidal? One possibility is that they would work so hard to pray and to have faith and to invoke their priesthood power, whatever it is, to get Heavenly Father to take this away. And then after so many years it doesn't work, they end that experience feeling like maybe they're so bad, maybe they're so broken that they're even beyond Heavenly Father's ability to help them. And it might also cause them to question their faith and Heavenly Father and everything around them, because we're taught as LDS people that if you have faith and if you pray, Heavenly Father can work miracles. And so and you guys can probably come up with your own theories about why hyper religiosity and personal righteousness as an attempt to change your sexual orientation could in the end lead to suicidal feelings. But the results were kind of undeniable. Bill, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, let me just read the next slide, John.
Okay, here it is.
This is not fictitious. This is an actual statement from one of our respondents. This approach was completely ineffective in changing my same-sex attraction, but eventually completely effective in understanding and truly accepting myself as gay. I prayed earnestly and studied scriptures daily. I fasted weekly for a couple of years. I read each ensign from cover to cover. I served in my wards, callings, and home teaching, sometimes to near exhaustion. The efforts to change, do all the church and its leaders teach on the subject, was profoundly damaging, depressing, demoralizing, and discouraging because, despite their assurances no real change was coming in diminishing my attractions to men or gaining attraction to women, no matter how hard I tried and believed. Life just kept getting darker and more hopeless because after doing all they said with so much effort and no change, I felt like a true failure, that I wasn't good enough for God to fulfill their words and promises with me. If God did not love me enough to change me, and since I as a gay person do not fit in God's plan, then there is no point in continuing to exist. Suicide truly seemed the only solution. Those years trying to deny and change what I am were very dark and hellish years despite zealous church service and my best efforts to be righteous. I just want to say that no human being ought to ever have to feel that way.
Thank you, Bill. So the takeaways from this part of our study were that most LDS same-sex attracted individuals attempt to change at some point, that religious and private methods were much more prevalent than therapist-led, and that religious and private methods were the most harmful, and they were used for the longest duration, that the overwhelming majority do not change their sexual orientation, and that most feel harmed by the efforts. So that is the major first finding of our study. That study was published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology, which, as Bill mentioned, is the flagship journal for the American Psychological Association, and it was a really big deal. So that was a nice validation of the framework of our study, because they don't accept junk; they accept only top-notch studies. The next part of our study was to understand identity, and we basically were able to divide our sample into 4 different frameworks for identity. I'll name them here and then I'll describe them. So identity number 1 is reject your LGBTQ identity. Think of people like that as people who say, I'm not gay, I'm not lesbian, I'm straight, or I'm same-sex attracted, but I'm not gay. That's the first category. The second category is those who compartmentalize, which means, okay, privately I'm gay, but publicly I'm straight. And so they kind of live that double life. That's what the second category can kind of represent. The third is the people who just rejected their religion altogether. I'm gay, or lesbian, or queer, or bisexual, and I'm no longer Mormon. And then the fourth category are those who integrated their LGBTQ identity and their religious identity. Basically people who said, I'm gay and I'm Mormon. So those are the 4 categories, and we wanted to understand what the outcomes were for those different sort of approaches. Were they equal? Were some more healthy? Were some less healthy? Does anyone guess which one was least healthy? Anyone? Stephanie, Ryan, anyone? So put your fingers up. Number 1, Stephanie's saying number 1, Ken saying 1, Ryan saying 4, Winona 4, Charles is 1, Zach 1. All right. Here is the answer. The most damaging of those 4 identities is number 1. Those who were complete. The Hansons are congratulating themselves on being correct. Good job, Hansons, and the rest of you. The most damaging thing you can do is just live in denial, where you present and in your mind try and convince yourself that you're straight when that's not the case. They had the highest levels of internalized homophobia, of identity confusion, of sexual identity distress, the lowest self-esteem. The second least healthy, or the second most damaging of the 4, were the compartmentalized. Bill, have you in the past, I'm trying to remember, not liked me using the term double life? Is there a term you prefer? Or
No, I don't think so.
okay, just making sure. I want to be sensitive to how you like to frame things. So the second most damaging is living the double life. So you can see the red indicates harm. The two most healthy of the four options were those who either left their religion altogether, or surprisingly, the ones who were integrated, which meant that they were able to harmonize their religion and their sexuality. And I've always agreed with this idea that you shouldn't have to choose between your sexuality and your faith. You should be able to integrate them. And so I was actually not expecting that outcome, but that's what the data showed. Now, there is a caveat to that. This is a bar that represents the findings. If you look under the INT little label at the bottom on that far right column, which has the highest quality of life, you'll see the percentage. What's the percentage of number of participants who fit in that category? 4%. What that indicates is very few people were able to live that integrated Mormon and gay life. Think of this as Tom Christofferson in a Manhattan ward who can teach, high priest quorum as an excommunicated Mormon and play the organ, and he's embraced by a super liberal bishop and stake president. Okay, Tom's going to say, I'm an integrated, LGBTQ Mormon, but he benefits in that instance from the privilege of a really liberal, progressive ward and really exceptional leadership. Think of maybe Oakland, California, Cambridge, Massachusetts, as some areas where a really progressive ward would be a warm and comfortable host to an out LGBTQ Mormon. Does that make sense? So this is possible, but rare. Most of the people who had healthy outcomes just had to leave their religion to be able to find health. Now, that's not what we're saying we want the outcome to be. That's just what the data showed at the time we conducted the study. So the takeaways from that are, from those parts of the study are, avoid sexual orientation change efforts, accept your LGBTQ identity. Some of the other findings from our study are come out to family, friends, and religious and work associates versus staying in the closet. Reduce or eliminate your LDS church activity, if it's not safe or healthy to be in the church or in your ward. People who lived outside of Utah fared better than those who lived inside of Utah. If you're going to remain LDS, then do your best to integrate into your sexuality and your religiosity together, so that you're not living a compartmentalized or false life. And we'll talk later about the value of being in committed same-sex relationships. So the final part of our study was to look at those options. If you guys remember, the options that the church traditionally has given LGBTQ Mormons are 1, mixed orientation marriage, 2, celibacy, or 3, excommunication. Prior to 2011, those were kind of your 3 choices. People may take exception to that, but that's kind of what our impression was. So we wanted to look at those options. How healthy is it to be in a mixed orientation marriage? How healthy is celibacy? How healthy is being in a same-sex marriage? Now, at the time, same-sex marriage wasn't nationally legal, but we were still able to get enough respondents to be able to actually measure the health of either common law unions, civil unions, or same-sex marriages with our respondents, even though this was 9 years ago. And so here are the results in terms of those various choices. We found that the worst possible choice that an LGBTQ Mormon could make was the path of celibacy. I wasn't expecting that. Although I've never tried to live a life of celibacy once I've, been an adult, basically post-mission. But the very lowest scores for quality of life were those who chose celibacy. That was the worst possible choice. There was a definite improvement if you were in same-sex non-committal relationships, but by far the healthiest outcome were people who are sexually active and in committed relationships. So, you know, if you're thinking about your LGBTQ youth or young adults, this may run counter to the Mormon brain, but if you want them healthy and happy, the data seem to suggest that sexuality is a really important part of a healthy adult life. And you can wish chastity for them, and that's fine. You just have to also understand that you're also sort of putting them in a category of quality life lower than that of those who report having lupus, which is a very debilitating disease that I wouldn't wish on anybody. And what we found is that those who were living celibate lives reported quality of life scores lower than people who had lupus. So that's kind of a stark reality, but that's what the data showed. The next slide was trying to study what quality of life as it relates to closeness to the church. This was one of the most stunning findings as far as I'm concerned. What you see at the bottom left is the quality of life reports of LGBTQ Mormons who are active in the church. And what you'll watch is as their distance from the church grows, their quality of life increases. So if they go inactive, they get a slight bump in their quality of life. If they become disfellowshipped, they get another slight bump in their quality of life. And then a big bump happens when they resign from the church. And ironically, the highest quality of life scores of all were found amongst the LGBTQ ex-Mormons who had been excommunicated from the church. Now, as someone who, I was an active Mormon at the time I did the study, that was not the results I wanted to see. I did not want to see that the happiest and healthiest LGBTQ Mormons were the ones who had been excommunicated. I wanted to see that the ones who stayed in the church were the healthiest and happiest, but that wasn't what the data showed. Obviously, good news is, since this study, the church has started to make the LDS experience maybe more welcoming and more humane for LGBTQ youth. I'm not in church these days, so I don't know if that's totally true, but it certainly seems to be better than it was when we conducted this study. The final quality of life slide that I wanted to report to you today was asking about relationships. And again, this study happened before same-sex marriage was legalized, but we just wanted to understand how healthy is it to be single and alone? How healthy is it to be in this mixed orientation marriage, which many bishops and stake presidents encouraged and recommended to our LGBT brothers and sisters for decades within the church? And then how healthy was it to be in a non-legal same-sex relationship? And then how important was it to have a fully legal same-sex relationship as an LGBTQ person? And what we found was that the single people were the least healthy, had the lowest quality of life scores. Mixed orientation marriage people did get a slight bump up, maybe because they weren't alone, maybe because they had kids, maybe because they weren't totally rejected from their ward or their family. But what we saw were these very stark increases in quality of life once you were in a same-sex relationship, and the highest quality of life rating of all was for legally married same-sex couples. And so, of course, I was thrilled when same-sex marriage was legalized, because that is literally the best possible option in terms of quality of life if you love and care for the health and well-being of your LGBT friend or family member. So now, really quickly, we're almost done. Let's jump to a slide that Bill's going to talk to us about.
We've been using language that hasn't suggested differences among gay and lesbian people. It's an important take home for those of you listening is that we're all different. Gay people are not all the same. We're showing you here a figure that represents the self-assigned scores of the people in our study with respect to the degree of their homosexuality. So Kinsey scores represent represent a scale, from a 7-point scale from 0 to 6. Those who self-designate as 0 say that they have complete homosexual feelings. And those at 6 say they are completely homosexual in their feelings. We ask for Kinsey scores in 3 settings: behavior, attraction, and identity. These are the attraction scores, the internal erotic feelings. It's important to repeat that there is no other way to find out the degree of a person's same-sex attraction except to ask them. You can't take a blood sample. There's no biochemical or biological measure of this. So the males and the females in our study are represented separately, the women in the red line. It's important to notice that there are very many more women who are in the bisexual range of this spectrum than there are men. It's about 20% more females. The important thing to think about when you look at these data are that people in the bisexual range of this continuum have some life options that are probably not open to those who are 5 and 6s on the scale. I'm talking about the ability, if you have some degree of attraction to both men and women, the ability to focus on one or the other of those 2 alternatives, which may change your options for marriage. In a religious setting, it may change your options for remaining active in the church, to get married and not to come out, to remain closeted, to remain invisible, if you will, to your friends and neighbors and the people in your congregation. Next slide, please. All right, just one other indicator of this. These data show, these are the data just for men, and it shows the data that we accumulated for divorce. So there's 2 variables going on here. One is, did the person serve an LDS mission or not? So that is represented in the color. Yes, the green represents those who served missions. The blue represents those who did not serve missions. The other variable, left and right, are Kinsey scores. So low represents those who are bisexual, those who were who represented a Kinsey score from 0 through 4, and high represented those who reported Kinsey scores of 5 and 6 in their attraction. So what did the data show? The data show that a mission has an effect. That is, in both left and right, the percentage of divorce as represented by the height of the green bars is less than it is for the blue. But notice the dramatic impact of Kinsey score. So those with Kinsey scores on the left that are low had the, and did not serve a mission, had a divorce rate above 60%. Much less if they had served a mission. Those with low Kinsey scores, those who are bisexual, are able to manage a mixed orientation marriage better than those who are in the high range of the Kinsey spectrum. So notice that for on the right, in the blue, those who did not serve a mission, those who have Kinsey scores 5 or 6 have about 95% divorce rates. Next slide. All right, so these are a few of our major findings. Orientation is not a choice. It's not a choice for you and I. It's not a choice for our gay brothers and sisters. It's a graded biological response, the result of what happens in embryonic life. We didn't address that particularly in what we've reported tonight, but 80% of the people in our study said that their explanation for their same-sex attraction was biology. It was not that their parents were not good parents, that their dads did not. It was not that they suffered abuse or distance from their parents. Reparative therapy doesn't work. Most of the people in our study, for the reasons that John explained, disaffiliate from the church. In part because mental health is lower under those circumstances. And as I just indicated, continue activity in the church, the ability to have a mixed orientation marriage, to stay active in the church, to stay invisible with respect to one's sexuality is predicted by where one is on that scale and is heightened if one is bisexual. Back to you, John, for the final slide.
Yeah, and just to kind of, this slide shares a lot of overlap with the previous slide. I want to say one thing about mixed orientation marriages. There is actually not, at the time of our study, there wasn't a lot of data about the success rates of mixed orientation marriages. So we did an analysis of our data of what the divorce rate was for mixed orientation marriages. And what we found is a 70% divorce rate amongst mixed orientation marriages. Now, you may think, well, that's not terrible because half of all marriages end in divorce anyway. But that's misleading because it turns out that only about 20% of first marriages end in divorce. What happens is the reason why the divorce rate is at 50 is because that first divorce leads to a second marriage, which often ends in divorce, which leads to a third marriage. And so the people that get married 2, 3, and 4 or 5 times bring the average divorce rate up. And so if you're comparing a 20 to 25% divorce rate for first marriages with a 70% divorce rate for mixed orientation marriages, that's a more accurate comparison. So in essence, if you encourage your child or if you yourself decide to choose that you're going to entertain a mixed orientation marriage, you should do so with the full understanding that there's almost a 300% increase in the likelihood that your marriage will end in divorce. And what parent would wish what parent of a straight child or a parent of an LGBT child would want for their child a 300% greater likelihood that marriage is going to fail. So that was a very important statistic for mixed orientation marriages. And so just a couple things to close. Basically, as Bill said, same-sex attraction, if you want to be sad, believe that your same-sex attraction is a choice or due to your upbringing or sin or abuse. Try to change your sexual orientation. Stay in the closet for as long as you can. Stay active in the church in ways that isn't good for your health. Stay single. Get in a mixed orientation marriage or stay celibate. That's the pathway to low quality of life and depression and anxiety and unhappiness and low self-esteem and sexual identity distress, etc. If you want to have the highest quality of life and the highest chance of happiness, believe that your same-sex attraction is biological, accept your same-sex attraction, come out of the closet. If the LDS church is not healthy for you, create distance between yourself and the LDS church. Become sexually active, but in a healthy and responsible way, and fight for what so many of us want as our ideal as well, which is ultimately to land in a committed, legal, same-sex relationship. So that is our data. Thank you for your patience in listening to us. And I think now is the Q&A time.
Yes, yes, it is. Thank you so much. This was amazing. Does anyone want to start with a question? You can.
Or
raise your
reaction.
hand.
If you're happy or sad or angry, we want to hear from you.
Yes.
I guess I have a question. It said something on one of the last couple slides that continued activity in the church was more likely if they were of their level of bisexuality. Am I understanding that correctly? And if
Yes.
so, is that specifically for people who are bisexual in cis hetero marriages or relationships, so they're passing as straight?
Yes, that's not always true. Sometimes the gay or lesbian member of that couple disclose that to their husband or wife. Sometimes they don't. But when we looked at the sexual orientation scale of those in mixed orientation marriages, the majority were bisexual in their self-assessed position on that scale. I hope that answered the question.
It did. Sorry, I just muted myself. So thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else?
Yeah,
You can
Mike,
just go ahead and unmute
just
yourself.
unmute. Okay. I'm John. How big was the population of your survey?
1,612.
Yeah, this was fascinating. I'm really glad you shared.
It's not just the largest sample of LGBTQ Mormons in a study like this. It's the largest sample of LGBT people ever assembled for a study like this. The next largest study we could find at the time of the study was like 200. And so this study was 8 times larger than, and that's not a Mormon, that's amongst LGBT religious people of any religious denomination. This study was 8 times larger than the largest study we could find.
And can I a comment? My understanding is you have published this in numerous scholarly journals, right? I mean,
Yep, the Journal of Counseling Psychology, the Journal of Homosexuality, the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Mental Health. Bill, what are some of the other
The
journals?
Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion.
Very reputable journal. Yeah, probably 6 or 7 different journals, 8 or 9
Sexuality
different.
and Marital Therapy.
So the structure of our study, the methods, have been validated by numerous independent scientific peer-reviewed bodies.
so I guess this is more of a comment. Yeah, so you know that it's well-founded, rigorous study because of that. I guess for me, I just wish it were out in the public more and more accessible and written up in more layman's terms like you did tonight, which I would love to have helped do, because what I've learned through Encircle is every parent has the best intent for their children, and their decisions they're making are based off of what they think will give them the best future and life. And not knowing these things, I mean, if these were more available, I think that it would help parents make, help their kids more easily or better. Just a comment.
Stephanie, I'll just say yes, amen to that. But I would just also add that if a parent whose child has just come out to them finds himself or herself in a state of confusion and uncertainty and anxiety, listen to your children. Your children are going to tell you what is true. Your children are going to tell you the same sorts of things that we found and formally reported in the scientific literature. So let's do both. Let's listen to our kids and love our kids. At the same time, let's find out what is available in the reliable literature and get information that we can trust.
I've got a question.
Please.
My name's Coleman Barney. I'm with Encircle Group, affiliated with Encircle, have 2 gay sons. They've been out for years and years. They're in their 30s now. So just on your study, you started the study by talking about how the 4th most participated in activity of an LGBTQ person when it comes to addressing their homosexual tendencies or is really the conversion therapy, which, you know, in Utah, we ultimately, because of the damage that that does, a law was passed to ban that kind of activity. Is there a correlation between the top 3 that you brought up and the same kind of damaging result, which is lots of young people die? And if so, how do you then suggest that you work to try and ban or change that kind of behavior or desire amongst a very faith-oriented constituency? So as an ally, how do I work on that without going to the legislature and say, I need to pass a law to keep preachers from preaching what they're preaching?
In answer to the first part of your question, yes, the correlation is the same and even higher. That is, when efforts at personal righteousness fail, the negative impact on the soul of the person who's trying to change is extreme. And as I read that quotation from that person, and the data that we have reinforce it. That statement that I read, I could have picked several hundred statements that would have all said the same thing. I tried with every instinct of my soul, and I couldn't. And when people whom you trust in the church in a religious setting tell you that you just have to have enough faith, you have to try hard enough, and you try harder than you think's possible and nothing happens, that tends to lead to a reduction in your faith in people who are telling you that you can change. Now, the second part of your question is how do we change that? And that's hard. Both in and out of the church, the harmful intellectual pathway is to start out by saying, being gay is bad. When things are bad, you change it. So same-sex attraction can be changed. It can be changed because it's not how you were born. It's not something that happened when your brain was imprinted during the embryonic stage of your life. It's because of some other reason. Your dad wouldn't play football with you in the backyard. Your mother was overbearing. You had an early sexual experience, either pleasurable or traumatic, that changed you. So it's that line of reasoning that we have to combat in legislatures or church leaders or neighbors. Getting the information out is not an easy task, and it's not easy to change people's biases. But that's the line of reasoning that we need to overcome.
And I'll add that the part of the complexity that's probably obvious to all of you is trying to make a certain type of prayer illegal or a certain type of doctrinal belief in the power of the atonement illegal, that's not what America's about. That's not something Utah is going to be very sensitive, sympathetic towards. And that's honestly, I think, one of the reasons why so many religious organizations these days are heavily emphasizing religious freedom, because what religion wants to be told by government, what they can and can't believe, what they can and can't practice. And so that makes this highly complicated. And I think the answer is what Encircle is doing. And Encircle is leading not just the state, but kind of the nation in this sort of motto of no sides, only love, of being very diplomatic, of being very strategic in how they operate, in slowly winning allies within the church by not alienating the church or members of the legislature, and then just slowly winning over hearts and minds over lots of time through commitment and education. And that's really how things are going to change. And that's what tonight's about. And so we just need to keep doing more of what you guys are doing. Support Encircle is the answer to your question.
So true.
Colin,
Has a question. Heidi?
let me just add a note to Colin. We can provide you with a summary of the studies. We can give you the references to where you can read the original papers. We can send you copies. You can duplicate that to your neighbors and people of influence. We would do any of those things to try to help.
I think
Right.
educating parents is key, because people don't care about science, because religious beliefs are often so much matters of the heart, that if you have to choose between your heart and science, you're likely going to go with heart most of the time. It's parents that are often the key to the well-being. As the studies from Caitlin Ryan's study, what's it called again?
Family acceptance
Family Acceptance Project. If parents are educated, and that's another thing that Encircle does so well, if parents can become educated about how to help mentor their kids, parents become the educational wedge to teach the kids what will and won't be helpful for them. And if parents are delivering the message, hey, believe in Heavenly Father, believe in the atonement, but understand that there are certain things that won't be helpful, that haven't been helpful for others. Maybe parents are part of the answer to that. Legislating and trying to lobby this is probably going to be very, very hard, if not impossible.
Right.